Hello students. So today we will be seeing the part 2 of breathing and exchange of gases. So till now we have studied how air enters lungs and leaves lungs, right? So just bringing the air inside the lungs is not enough, right? Suppose the food is delivered to your house gate but hasn't reached your room yet. Will it be useful? No. So similarly, oxygen entering the lungs becomes useful only when it reaches blood, tissues and then cells. Okay, at the same time, the carbon dioxide which is produced by the cells must be removed continuously. Okay, this is the simultaneous process which is happening in our body in our day-to-day life. So this entire process is called as exchange of gases. Okay, as of now, we have seen that oxygen becomes useful only when it reaches blood, tissue and cells. Okay, and CO2 is also produced by the cells which must be removed. So this process is called as exchange of gases. So inhaling O2 and exhaling CO2, and this process is called as exchange of gases, and how this gases exchange among the alveoli and then to blood and then to tissue and then to cell. Okay, this process we will be seeing in the upcoming topics. Let us move on to alveoli. Okay, so what is alveoli? Inside our lungs there are millions of tiny balloon like structure that is called as alveoli. Okay, so you can imagine these alveoli is like apple grapes. Okay, so alveoli is efficient for blood supply because it has huge surface area, thin membrane and rich blood supply, and this is why the blood supply is efficient in the alveoli. So now we have already seen in the part 1 that exchange of air will take place from the higher pressure to the lower pressure. Now let us recall what happens during the inspiration and what happens during the expiration based on the pressure. Okay, so during inspiration, which pressure will be high and which pressure will be low? You have to tell me that. You just pause the video and try to guess. Okay, in inspiration, the atmospheric pressure should be high and lung pressure should be low. And in expiration, atmospheric pressure should be low and lung pressure should be high. And this is how the air moves from higher concentration to the lower concentration. Now let's move on to the story of oxygen. Okay, so when we inhale atmospheric air, and this atmospheric air will enter alveoli. Okay, so when the atmospheric air enters the alveoli, inside the alveoli, the O2 concentration is high. So, alveolar PO2 is also high. PO2 is nothing but the partial pressure of O2. Okay. And now, at the same time, the deoxygenated blood from the body will reach the lungs. Through which part? Through pulmonary artery. Okay. So, the deoxygenated blood will be low in oxygen, high in carbon dioxide. So, when the oxygen is low, automatically the partial pressure of O2 will also be low in the deoxygenated blood. So, what happens now? Nature will always try to balance concentration. So, there is already too much of oxygen in the alveoli and very little in the blood. So, from alveoli to blood, the oxygen will move. So, therefore, the blood will become oxygenated now. So, this oxygenated blood will travel to tissues. So, what will happen in the tissues? So, inside the tissue, cells continuously use oxygen for the production of energy. Okay, so oxygen becomes low in tissues. So, from blood, the oxygen will move to the tissues. At last, from tissues, it reaches the cells. Okay, so now let us see the path where how the oxygen travels from the atmosphere to the tissues and cells. So now from the atmosphere, the oxygen will travel to alveoli, and from alveoli it will move to the blood, and from blood to tissues, and from tissues to cells. Okay, so we have already studied that how atmospheric air enter into our body through external pair of nostrils and then to nasal chamber, through nasal passage and then to pharynx and then to trachea through larynx. Okay, I hope you all remember what is nasal chamber, what is pharynx, what is trachea and what is larynx and everything. So now let's move on to carbon dioxide story. Okay, Now, carbon dioxide is continuously produced by the cells because they perform metabolism. So, inside the tissues, the concentration of CO2 will become high, and in the blood, the concentration of CO2 is low than the tissue. When compared to the tissue, the concentration of CO2 will be less in the blood. So, this is how the diffusion will happen. From tissues to blood, the diffusion happens. So, the carbon dioxide from the tissue reaches the blood. Okay. And then from the blood, it reaches the lungs. So, now alveoli will be low in the concentration of carbon dioxide, but blood will be high in the concentration of CO2. So, now CO2 will diffuse from the blood to the alveoli, and alveoli will take responsible for the expiration of CO2. Now, the most important point, CO2 will diffuse faster than O2. Why? Because CO2 is 20 to 25 times soluble than the oxygen. And if there is a small pressure difference between the atmospheric pressure or if there is a small pressure difference between the tissues and the blood or blood and the alveoli, this diffusion will happen. So below I have attached the diagram of the respiratory membrane and pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. Okay. So now let's see the respiratory membrane and then we will look on to the diagrams. So the respiratory membrane will be very thin and it has three layers. Usually we will have a question, right? How gas can move so quickly? Because respiratory membrane is extremely thin. Okay, and it has three layers. What are all those? Alveolar epithelium, basement membrane, and capillary endothelium. That it is important to understand that the thinner the membrane, the faster the diffusion. So this is very important line that you have to keep in your mind. So, if respiratory membrane becomes thick due to disease, the exchange of gas will become difficult. Okay? Okay. Now, let me recall the final concept of exchange. Okay? So, how O2 will travel from alveoli to blood to tissues, and how CO2 will travel from tissues to blood to alveoli. So, how does this happen? The PO2, partial pressure of oxygen, should be high in alveoli and should be less in blood. And when the travel happens from the blood to tissues, the partial pressure of PO2 and blood should be higher than the tissues. And the same happens for the tissues. In tissue, PCO2 will be high and in blood, PCO2 will be low. And this is how the carbon dioxide will travel to the blood from the tissue. And then from the blood, PCO2 will move to alveoli because there will be higher concentration of PCO2 in blood and lower concentration of PCO2 in the alveoli. So now we will be seeing the table and then we will be moving to the diagram. Okay. So in this table, first let us look on to the oxygen movement. Okay. So in alveoli, PO2 of alveoli is 104 mmHg and PO2 of deoxygenated blood is 40 mmHg. Since oxygen pressure is high in the alveoli, so oxygen will be diffused from the alveoli to the blood. So now the blood will be becoming the oxygenated blood. Now the concentration of PO2 in the oxygenated blood is 95 mmHg. Okay, with this we will be completing the movement of oxygen. Now we will see the carbon dioxide's movement. PCO2 concentration in the deoxygenated blood is 45 mmHg and PCO2 concentration in alveoli is 40 mmHg, right? So, the blood will be rich in CO2 and alveoli is less in CO2. Now, the CO2 will be diffused from the blood to the alveoli because this has higher partial pressure and this has lower partial pressure. And that is how the movement of air works. So, then CO2 will be exhaled out. Okay. Now let us see how the gas is exchanged at our body tissues. Okay. So systematic arteries carry oxygenated blood. The PO2 in oxygenated blood is in the concentration of 95 mmHg and PO2 in the tissues is 40 mmHg. Okay. So from the higher pressure, the air will move to the lower pressure. So from blood, the oxygen moves to the tissues, and cells use oxygen for the respiration. And then let us see carbon dioxide. So from tissues, the tissue having the concentration of 45 mmHg. Okay. So from tissues, the PCO2 will be moved to blood. Okay. And that is how the blood will become deoxygenated. Okay. Now let us see this diagram. Blue and red blood vessels. Okay. So blue side will be having deoxygenated blood and less O2, high CO2, and it will be going towards the lungs. And when we look on the pink or red side, it will be carrying the oxygenated blood and more O2 and less CO2, and it will be going towards the body tissues. And that is how the supply happens. So when the oxygenated blood reaches the body tissues, those oxygens are utilized by the cells in the tissues, and these cells will be producing CO2 as they have performed the metabolism activities, and this CO2 will again move to the blood, and this blood will move to the lungs. Okay. Now let's look on to the respiratory membrane diagram. So there are 3 layers in the respiratory membrane. Okay. As we have already studied, one is squamous epithelium of alveolus, another one is basement membrane. Okay. Another one is endothelium of blood capillaries. Okay. Squamous epithelium will be thin walled and only one cell thickness it will be. Okay. Now when we look on to the basement substance, that is nothing but basement membrane, it is thin supporting layer. And when we look on to the endothelium, it is thin wall of capillary. So these are all the 3 layers that are present in the respiratory membrane. Okay, which helps in the respiration. And now, why is gas exchange fast? Why, can anyone answer? Because membrane is very thin, it has large surface area, rich blood supply, and partial pressure gradient exchange. And this is how the gas exchange happens very fast. The diffusion will also happen very quickly. And now we will be seeing the complete flow of gases. Okay, we have seen here in the table, right? So we will be seeing that now. From the atmosphere, it moves to the alveoli and then moves to the blood and then to the tissues. So from 159, it goes to 104 and then 95 to 40. Okay. And carbon dioxide's path is from the tissues to blood and then to alveoli and then to atmosphere. Now, how it travels from 45 to 40 to 0.3. So, in this, we can see that oxygen always moves from higher PO2 to lower PO2, and as well as CO2 will always move from higher PCO2 to lower PCO2. Okay. Now, once the oxygen enters blood, how it is transported? Can plasma alone carry enough oxygen? No. And that is why nature designed a special pigment called hemoglobin. Okay. So hemoglobin is present inside RBC, which is responsible for giving us the red color, and it also contains iron. Okay. Now, how hemoglobin is responsible for transferring the O2 to all body tissues. Now we will be seeing that. Okay. Oxygen binds reversibly with Hb. So this is the very important equation that shows how oxygen is binded reversibly with hemoglobin. So one hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecule. Okay, this is very important point, note on. Now, inside the lungs, the concentration of PO2 will be high and temperature will be low and PCO2 will be low. All these conditions are the favorable conditions for the oxygen binding. Now, the oxygen got binded to Hb. And how it will be getting unloaded? That we will see now. Okay. In tissues, oxygen concentration will be low, PCO2, that is CO2 concentration will be high, temperature will be high, and hydrogen ion concentration will also be high. And this condition will force Hb to release oxygen into the tissues. Now let us imagine hemoglobin as a delivery truck. At lungs, truck get loaded with the oxygen and truck unloads the oxygen at the tissues. Okay, now we will be seeing the oxygen dissociation curve. When we plot PO2 versus HP saturation, we will be getting the sigmoid curve. Why sigmoid is obtained? Because after the binding of one O2 molecule, the next all of the O2 molecule will be binded very easily. So how does the transportation of CO2 happens? CO2 is transported in blood as bicarbonate ions. And now if you look at the pH regulation that I have mentioned here, if the H plus concentration becomes high, the blood will become acidic. And if the H plus concentration is low, the blood will become basic. So what happens in the tissues? In the tissues, the CO2 production will be high and the reaction will be moved towards the right side. And how does the reaction will move towards the right side? What is the right side? From here to here and here to here. Okay. So more bicarbonate ions and H plus ions are formed. Okay. In lungs, CO2 is removed. Okay. The reaction will be moved from what? Right to left in lungs. Okay. So the CO2 will be removed and then it will move from right to left and then the CO2 will again be regenerated and expelled. Okay. Now, in the tissue level, CO2 is produced more, so more bicarbonate ions are formed. In the lung level, the reaction reverses. CO2 is released. Okay. Let's move on to the respiratory rhythm center. So, before that, now students, our breathing is automatic, right? Even during sleeping, we continue to breathe. Who is controlling this process? Our brain. Okay. So, in our brain, the respiratory rhythm center is present. Where? In medulla oblongata. So, this is very important point that you have to note down. This medulla oblongata will be acting as a breathing control room. Okay. Now, what is pneumatic center? Pneumatic center is nothing but points. So, it fine tunes breathing rate. Okay. Actually, our breathing is mainly controlled by carbon dioxide and not by oxygen. So, how does it happen? When CO2 is high, the brain will sense the danger. Okay. So, immediately respiratory center stimulates breathing. Breathing rate will be increased and brought back to the normal and extra CO2 gets removed immediately. And one important line that you have to keep in mind is CO2 is the major chemical regulator for respiration. Okay. Now let's see about the disorders, respiratory disorders. There are three main respiratory disorders. They are asthma, emphysema, and occupational disorders. Now, what is asthma? In asthma, bronchi and bronchioles will become inflamed. Okay, airway will become narrow. So, this causes wheezing and difficulty in breathing in the patients. Okay, so two things that you have to keep in mind is bronchi and bronchioles will become inflamed and airway will become narrow. And what happens in the emphysema? In emphysema, alveolar walls will get destroyed. This is mainly caused due to cigarette smoking. Okay, so if you know someone who smokes daily or repeatedly, just ask them to stop because that will save their life. Okay, so now, what happens during emphysema? Alveolar wall will break and surface area gets decreased. Automatically, when the surface area gets decreased, the less gas exchange will happen. We have already studied that alveoli has higher surface area, and that is why air exchange happens very quickly. And in emphysema, alveolar walls break, surface area gets decreased, and automatically, when the surface area gets decreased, the gas exchange will be reduced. So this will be very dangerous if it is continued. Now, what is occupational disorders? In industries like mining, stone breaking, grinding, will have workers who continuously inhale dust. So this will have the long-term effect. What is the long-term effect? Dust will be continuously inhaled by the worker and it will definitely damage the lungs and it will cause fibrosis. So students, you must know that breathing is not just taking in air and out. It involves the systems like pressure gradient, diffusion, blood transport, neural regulation, and every second our body performs all these activities. So with this, I'm completing this video, and next video will be solving the questions for this chapter. So stay tuned. And if you haven't subscribed my channel yet, please do subscribe and support. Okay. Bye. Take care.